Hi, my name is Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the statement from the British Nobel Prize winning geneticist that we made poor decisions in responding to the pandemic and lost a great deal of public trust because of the government's insistence of surrounding everything with a shroud of secrecy. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, just from a personal point of view, I remember at the beginning of the crisis in the UK, it had already emerged elsewhere, we were playing catch up. Former advisors to the government, different governments, saying that what they'd learned from past emergencies was that it's absolutely vital for public confidence to present the same people to issue statements and to keep everyone informed. Now, applying this lesson to our current emergency would have meant that the daily briefings which were happening should have been fronted by Boris Johnson every time. He also shouldn't have taken the chief scientific advisor and chief medical officer, really. The reason he did so was to then palm off the blame later on, as indeed he did. The way Sage Scientists, which is the scientific advisory group for emergencies, the government's scientific advisors, the way they allowed themselves to be abused in this way, out of political expediency, for ministers who had no intention of following the science, had been criticised from all quarters, including myself, for some time, right from the start, in fact. And Sir Paul Nurse, the Nobel Prize winning British geneticist, was no exception. He said that it blurred the lines between advice and decision making, because what it allowed people to think, especially with Boris Johnson and other ministers saying that they were being led by the science, and because these guys were there to field questions, it allowed people to think that Sir Patrick Vallance, the chief scientific advisor, and Professor Chris Whitty, the chief medical officer, were involved in the decision making. They were not. They were providing advice. They are paid by the government to advise. That is it. The decisions were made by government. Boris Johnson, if you want to be charitable, Dominic Cummings, if you've paid attention, but certainly not Sage advisors. And it should have been Boris Johnson fronting the briefings and making it clear that he was taking responsibility. And that should have been it. Naturally, when Boris Johnson became seriously ill, obviously being replaced by Dominic Raab at the briefings as he was in Parliament. Of course, had the government been learning lessons and paying attention to wisdom, then there is every chance that the Prime Minister would not have been struck down by the virus. But we won't know that. He may have still been. The point is that the public, being briefed daily by the same person, the person who bears ultimate responsibility, as much as he often tries to dodge it, of course, would have formed a connection there. But the briefings were run like musical chairs. We got a succession of different ministers, not all of them even very senior, as well as different so-called advisors. And when you combine that with the fact that different ministers were giving contradictory statements to the press about what the rules meant, having clearly not been fully briefed themselves, much less involved in decision making, or perhaps they were briefed and they just weren't bright enough to remember the rules, you made it impossible for the public to really know what was going on. It's like, who do they believe? When even members of the government are contradicting each other, who is the one person we need to listen to? If Boris Johnson was fronting that briefing every single day, or Dominic Raab while he was ill, then okay, that's the one we listen to. Michael Gove said a thing. Did he? That's nice. I'm going to listen to this guy. And especially when the legally binding regulations released by the government without any parliamentary scrutiny contradicted the advice that the government gave in briefings or even on the website. I mean, that's been a characteristic even now. Even the latest regulations, there are contradictions between what the regulations say from a legal point of view and what the government website says it's like the ministers don't even understand what their own regulations mean. But that is just my take on the process. That's what I observed. So for Sir Paul Nurse, who is a scientist of international renown beyond dispute, of course, Nobel Prize winner, he described the process of decision making as being made in what he termed a black box of scientists, civil servants and politicians. He said that there should have been more transparency and scrutiny. Absolutely true. It's all right ministers having said, oh, you know, our advisors advised this. We knew it wasn't true anyway if we paid any attention, but for most people they didn't. We should have known what that advice was. We needed to know what the advice was so that ministers couldn't tell these lies. And it's obvious to many of us from the start as well, really. I mean, when you're not a small-minded egomaniac, you appreciate the need for scrutiny. I mean, how many times in your life have you avoided looking like a right prat because you shared your idea and someone pointed out what you had failed to consider? Oh yeah, I'd better revise that plan. And then it went better. Opening up your planning to scrutiny actually avoids you having to look foolish. But to the dim-minded and those with easily bruised egos, they think the opposite is true. They can't take criticism, so they forge ahead with their ideas, not allowing anything close to scrutiny anywhere near it, completely oblivious to the fact that you'll just be criticised later when the whole thing goes tits up. And as Sir Paul noted, this led to poor decisions being made and it put public trust at risk. Bear in mind that the scandal involving Dominic Cummings' novel approach to eye tests blew a massive hole in that public trust, but it was already suffering before then. It's not like the public had a lot of trust in the government and then it just went down with Dominic Cummings. It was already going down, and it's continued to suffer since, quite independently of that incident. I mean, recently, with the government changing positions so rapidly, many members of the public who sort of went along with the Dominic Cummings crap are just getting the impression that ministers haven't a clue, and so they stop listening to them. Now, some of the changes of position that the government are making are not necessarily just caused by being caught on the hop. Some of them are. Some are just a natural consequence of reacting to the latest data, but because the government's methodology is not being publicly communicated, and they're also clearly lying about certain aspects as well. I mean, they talked about this risk rating was supposed to be in level 4, at 3 now. It was 4, now it's level 3. Except it's not, because the process for working it out has been changed and it keeps being changed. We know it's just someone's throwing a dart in a dartboard, or has just decided we needed to be at level 3 and so declared it level 3. So because the government are clearly lying about some things and they're not bringing the public along with their plans, they're not really communicating those plans, and we've dropped the daily briefings altogether now. No one when you look at polling now, there's even fewer people even think they understand. There were a lot of people before who would be confident they understood the rules. If you probed them, some of them would find that they didn't. But nowadays, even that confidence has gone because the briefings aren't there. And all of their plans hinge on widespread compliance amongst the population. But as Sir Paul cited the example of lighthouse laboratories. So these were supposed to be labs set up for testing, set up from scratch. And what Sir Paul said is that large laboratories take time to set up. And anyone with any knowledge of such matters could have told the government it would take months. How was that decision made, he asked. And that's the problem, isn't it? You know, and not just with COVID management, but Boris Johnson's government in general, including Brexit matters and ordinary domestic affairs. How are these decisions made? Because they don't make sense. They are listening to a very narrow selection of people, Now, that in itself immediately cuts down on your potential to spot problems before they occur. But it's not even like that narrow section of people even have the expertise to offer good advice. They're all Dominic Cummings types who talk a good fight but don't have any personal expertise to really be able to deal with a complex problem. I mean, speaking of Dominic Cummings, how is it possible that a man who has spent years talking about the need for government decisions to be based on scientific expertise, how does he tackle a huge scientific and medical emergency by cutting off a great deal of that available expertise and completely ignoring the expertise that's left to you in their meetings? Sir Paul said that our society is becoming increasingly technocratic and complex, and we need complex discussions and the use of science to impact policy. True enough, and do you know what? This is exactly what Dominic Cummings has been arguing for years, but we're doing the opposite of that. He also cited recommendations made in the wake of the BSE crisis. Oh, that takes me back. I was at university at the time, so that tells you it was a while ago. Now, the inquiry into that said that there needs to be a separation between those analysing data and assessing risk and those making decisions. There has been no such separation during the COVID crisis. So another example of lessons learned from past emergencies being ignored by this government to all of our cost. And the tragic thing is that they're repeating failures that they've already made, and it doesn't seem to have slowed down their flawed way of doing things. They haven't at any point paused and considered if they should change their approach. They just keep on with it. And I don't know if this is just a consequence of having people in charge who've gone through their entire lives without ever having to face consequences for their cock-ups. And so they've had decades of positive reinforcement in always just forging ahead with the first thought that comes in their head. But whatever the reason, with the same levels of secrecy being adopted in present and future decision making, I think only a fool would think that the outcomes would be any better than they've been in the past. So those are my thoughts, along with Sir Paul's. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.